All right, everyone. We are here with a returning guest, one of our favorite, Mr. Mark Wiley from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Division of Wildlife. Say that 10 times fast. Sir, how we doing?
I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
I'm glad to have you on again. So if you guys don't recall, we had him on episode 8, Ben.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, do you believe that by the time that this releases, we'll be in March, and you will be episode 56? 57?
I think 57.
You believe that?
Excellent.
we,
Yeah,
yeah,
congratulations.
thank you.
That's
Thank you. You were
that's quite a feat.
our first true I don't want to say credited scholar, if you will, but you were our first person that actually had some
A
title.
degree to back up with it. Yeah.
So thanks for taking
Well,
a chance on just a couple newbie hunters over here.
hey, thanks for taking a chance on me and giving me a fancy title. I appreciate that.
Hey, you're welcome. You're welcome. And then I want to touch on too. So today's episode isn't going to necessarily be. We're going to cover wild turkey in the state of Ohio, but I'm not going to cover wild turkey biology. If you want to learn more about what they eat, where they live, where they nest, how they take care of their clutches, their predation, go back to episode 8. Mark dives into all of that information very well, and you can find that there. So definitely, if you're interested in turkey as the season is coming up here shortly, go back to episode 8 and check that out. If you want to learn more about what just happened since the last time we talked to Mark, this is your podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So
Do you want to address the video issue?
yeah, so Tonkovich won't hear this, but these ODNR guys, I'm telling you, I'm gonna have to get with somebody over there and talk to them about their setup. These ODNR guys, they keep
Pretty strict on the computer
on
stuff.
the computer setup. Yeah, so they both Mark and Mike Tonkovich both somehow their technology isn't working when it comes to video. Shout out to the IT department for Division of Wildlife, but we're gonna have to have a conversation with them, Mark.
That's all right. We're still going to get
no
it done.
comment from me. Yeah.
Well, Mark, let's go ahead and for those people who may have just joined us here recently and haven't heard your episode yet, can you go ahead and just give a 30,000 foot view of who you are and what you do with the state?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a research biologist with the Division of Wildlife within the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. My responsibility is principally forest game birds, so that includes wild turkey, which eat up a lot of my time, certainly. But with that, I cover ruffed grouse, American woodcock, and then some small game. I do some of the hunter surveys that maybe some of your listeners receive at the end of the season. We're about to send out the survey for the season that's just coming to an end as rabbit season
Yes.
closes end of February. So some surveys will go out and I help administer those and kind of keep tabs on what's going on with some of our small game populations. I'm originally from Central Ohio. Graduated from Ohio University and then Ohio State University, working with northern bobwhite. So I've kind of always been in the game bird world. I'm a relative newcomer to wild turkey. I've only been working with wild turkey for about 6 years now. But when you sit in meetings that have made wild turkey research, a 30-year career,
Sure.
even with 6 years, you feel like you're still a newcomer. So.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And there's no game bird that has seen as much of a change as the wild turkey population, for sure.
It's a tremendous success story, absolutely.
Well, I want to give you the opportunity. You kind of touched on it there with what you do, but let's dive into you and the team of the team of biologists that the division has. What have you guys been up to since the last time we spoke? I know, last time that we spoke in February of 21, or 22, in February of 22, we experienced some new changes this year, or that year and this year, for the bag limits, as well as some of the season harvest dates and fall season and spring season. But what have you guys been up to since the last time we spoke?
Yeah, you're correct. There've been a number of changes recently, and to rewind, I guess, a little bit more, many of those changes prompted by a dip in wild turkey abundance.
Yep.
The first evidence we saw of that came in 17, 18, and 19, 3 consecutive years where we had pretty poor poult production, at least our poult index, where we measure the average number of poults per hen. That dipped well below our long-term average for those 3 years that I mentioned. And of course, that's going to have consequences when it comes to spring harvest and the number of gobbling birds that hunters encounter each spring, which caused a lot of concern in that community, as well as within the Division of Wildlife. When we have major dips in abundance like that for a fairly common species, even though our turkey population remains strong, we want to know why. Hunters want to know why.
Sure.
Why are we seeing this change? So there are things we know and things we don't know. As I mentioned, we know that we had fairly poor poult numbers in those years. We can't explain exactly why. There is research that kind of suggests some of the major factors to impact poult production, nest success, poult survival are things like weather and predation and habitat availability and quality. There's a lot of things that go into whether or not an individual poult survives to adulthood. And those things play off of each other. So it gets fairly complicated pretty quickly. So what we could say is poult production was poor. What we couldn't really say is why. We are very fortunately, since we last talked, we've had 2 really good poult years.
Good.
So 2021, which I guess would have been just before we talked last, and then summer of 2022, both of those years were really positive. We had above average poult numbers.
Okay.
So that sort of I won't say that's going to get us back to turkey abundance levels that hunters are accustomed to, Ohio hunters, but it certainly is a step in the right direction, a couple steps in the right direction. But we still want to understand, we still want to try to understand why we see those changes. And so we initiated a study, not only with the Ohio State University, which a university we typically partner with for major wildlife research projects, but we're also part of a multi-state collaboration. So with Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey, all 4 states, somewhat in the same region. Certainly Pennsylvania, our neighbor to the east. So it'll be meaningful to be able to compare some of these research results with our neighbor. And they've got Penn State involved on their end. So it'll be Pennsylvania Game Commission partnered with Penn State, and the Ohio Division of Wildlife partnered with Ohio State. And we're going to be doing some of the very same hen monitoring research over the next couple of years to try to answer some of those questions about wild turkey production and survival.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit more, because I think the listener is going to really kind of think that the way that you guys are going about trying to find that out is going to be pretty cool. Going to the 2022, the last season, we had just said it before we started recording, but 11,872. Was that right? Is that what I think that's
you
what you said?
It.
Yeah. Well, I had my computer up like you did. No, I'm just kidding. No, but 11,872. That's a pretty meager in terms of what people are probably used to in the years before. But I think one key thing that Mark said that I just picked up on, I didn't even have this in my notes. He and the team at ODNR looked the last 3 years to make the decision that they did that affected last season. Mm-hmm. The important thing that I found on that, who else said that? Mike Tonkovich. Mm-hmm. They looked at the last 3 years of data. They don't look at 1 year individually to make a rash decision. So I feel like hunters are very passionate. I'm very passionate. You're very passionate. People want to be able to harvest more animals, and people want the population to succeed. And sometimes I feel like the division kind of gets a bad rap, and people make it seem like they make rash decisions on season dates and season bag limits and what have you. Look at CWD, for example. Look at the wild turkey stuff, for example. But I want to give you the opportunity to let people know that these decisions were made over a several year period of research. It wasn't something that they just dreamed up of overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly, and I may have jumped ahead a little bit getting into the research project. Yeah, we
Yeah.
jumped right over some of the regulation changes that
Yeah.
occurred in 2022, or I did. I guess I should take the
That's all
blame
good.
there. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you can make the joke we move at the pace of state government. That is true. I mean, there are multiple levels of sort of checks and balances that regulations go through, and I think that's an important process. I don't think you would want, one individual, whether it's the biologist or an administrator or whoever it might be, to make all the decisions about wildlife regulations. And so when you add layers, proposals coming from the Ohio Division of Wildlife and going to the Ohio Wildlife Council for a vote, when you add those layers, it slows it down, so we move slower, but it gives the opportunity for public input and for as I mentioned, checks and balances on various decisions. So things do move slow, but as you said, they often move slow because we want to act. We want to be responsive to any change, but we also want to act deliberately and not make major changes to these important seasons. We issue 60 or used to, when we had a 2-permit system, issue in excess of 60,000 spring turkey permits, and we've got a lot of folks that are very passionate turkey hunters. We don't want to change regulations on them on a whim, and we want to justify any changes that we do make. So to get back to it, when we saw that dip in wild turkey numbers, we not only had concern within the agency, but we were getting pressure from outside, from the wild turkey hunter, to say, hey, we're not seeing the birds out there. We're not hearing the gobbling that we're used to. We might need to give up some of the opportunity that we have in one form or another.
Yeah.
And we actually put out surveys to our wild turkey hunters, and they were very supportive of a bag limit reduction in the spring, and most were also supportive of some reduction to the fall season.
Yes.
So the bag limit change happened in 2022. We went from 2 bearded birds in the spring down to 1. And again, that remains very much supported by spring turkey hunters. They seem to agree with that change still, even going into the 2024 season. We're currently proposing regulations. And then the fall change, it received a little bit of opposition, and we made some tweaks to that. We ended up reducing that season by about 2 weeks.
Yep. Yeah.
Just to curtail fall harvest a little bit. We want to maintain that opportunity, although it's not as popular as the spring season is in Ohio. There are some passionate fall hunters out there that very much enjoy that fall hunting opportunity, and we want to maintain that for them.
Sure.
But with the changes that were made to spring during that dip in wild turkey numbers, it seemed appropriate to curtail that fall season slightly as well.
Sure. And and Ben knows I've kind of hunted the same area by my house for a couple of years now, and I can kind of agree to most hunters. I just don't see the numbers of birds that I feel like the area should hold, especially after talking to you and kind of knowing what their habitat is going to be. And then this year, I think I sent you saw the video while I was hunting on more than one occasion, Mark, and I saw a whole flock of hens in the fall. And, and we're talking 10 to 12 birds at one time. And it was just like, hurry up and get on my phone and maybe try to get that. Are they going to get close enough that I need to get my tag? Excuse me, man, I never had that opportunity. And so it was cool. I'm interested that, it's interesting to me that there was some opposition to shortening the weeks in fall. I mean, I know that there's a lot of people that love chasing those birds in the fall, but you feel like the horned animals are definitely king in the fall time, and you figure a lot of people wouldn't necessarily care too much. I know I certainly didn't, but then again, I wouldn't call myself a quote unquote diehard turkey hunter.
Yeah, that's the key, because some guys just love to fish, some guys just love to turkey hunt, bird hunt, whatever.
Sure.
So that makes sense.
Certainly. And the fall hunt is a different hunt for several
Yes.
reasons,
Yes.
and you can almost categorize people differently in the fall. In the spring, we're all kind of doing the same thing.
Yep.
I mean, we may go about it differently, but we're all pursuing that gobbler. We're calling, we're using decoys in some form. We're trying to call that bird into us. In the fall, it's different. It's not the breeding season. So
Yep.
birds are in flocks. They can be a little more challenging in that regard. They've
Mhm.
got a lot of eyes looking out for movement or any form of potential threat.
Yep.
You've got folks that make a more traditional hunt, breaking up the flock and then calling birds back into them. You've got folks that are
Yes.
more the opportunistic deer hunter. And so fall is a unique season. It can be challenging to as we experienced,
Mhm.
to sort of make adjustments to that season and not step on anybody's toes or upset any one group. So
Sure.
I think we came to a reasonable agreement with the changes we made. We addressed some of the hunters' concerns through that public comment period when the regulations were proposed, and I think we're in a good place now with folks generally satisfied with Ohio's regulations.
Sure. And I want to kind of touch into the next point here. I mean, it's all kind of going along the same lines, but we mentioned that 11,872, harvest. Is the division happy with that number, or is the division happy with what they saw in terms, or is it too early to tell yet in terms of your research data? But would you consider last season and the changes that you made last season a success, basically, is what I'm asking?
Yeah. Tricky question. So I try not to get too hung up on that total
Sure.
harvest number, and that's for a few reasons. Our hunter numbers change year to year, and
Yes.
in general, we're losing hunters. So and we're losing spring turkey hunters. In the early 2000s, we used to issue about 90,000 permits, and that was when you could buy 2 permits. In the most recent year that you could still purchase 2 permits, 2021, we only issued 61,000 spring permits. So
Yeah.
a loss of about 30,000 permits from the peak, what some would consider the peak of Ohio's wild turkey abundance, till last year, 2021.
Yeah.
And then that changed, of course, considerably when we reduced the bag limit from 2 to 1. Of course, you're going to issue fewer permits because we had a few thousand hunters who were typically buying 2 permits. So the number I tend to focus on is not usually the total harvest. It's the permit success rate.
Okay.
So of those permits that are issued, how many successfully filled their tag and harvested a bird?
Gotcha. And you'd be
looking. And in good years, it's approaches about 25% in our really good years. In our bad years, so the last few years, the last few springs, it dropped well below 20 and was more like 17 or 18%.
I was going to say, yeah, right.
And it's so 2022, it actually crept back up. I think we were very close to 20%, but not in the high levels that we see in really good years, but we were a few percentage points higher, and that pairs well with our brood data I mentioned before. We had 2 really good years of brood production according to our index. So a lot of those birds would have been jakes last year, and hopefully will be, well, not hopefully, many of them should be 2-year-old gobblers this coming spring. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see that permit success rate up even higher this year, and we can make guesses about what that might do to the total spring harvest number, but that's entirely dependent on how many hunters we have out there pursuing. I want to see that the hunters that we do have out there, however many it might be, are slightly more successful than the previous year, and that's gonna suggest to me that our bird numbers are improving, and we actually saw that in fall 22. So even though we had a shorter season by 2 weeks, we killed more birds than the previous year in the fall. And it's not more permits being issued. We actually issued fewer permits, but the hunters were more successful. And that's typically what we see after some good poll years is more successful hunters.
Yeah, and I wonder how many of those were just probably taking the opportunity. They weren't passing on the opportunity. You know what I mean? Like, because if the week was shortened another 2 weeks, I'm less inclined to pass up on that one bird for a chance of potentially doing another one in a week later, because you never really know what's going to happen. So
there's a chance that the shorter season made hunters more likely to take a bird, but we don't survey hunters in enough detail to really get into their minds about when they pull the trigger or loose an arrow.
Oh, sure.
So I kind of operate under the assumption that a turkey hunter in the fall is going to take the first opportunity that they have, unless they're in pursuit of some particular bird, or they want a bearded bird, or whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
And surveys kind of suggest that's not really the case. For some hunters, that may be the case. But I don't know. I'm somewhat skeptical that hunters are passing on a lot of turkey harvest opportunity, thinking that they'll have a better opportunity later in the season.
I know, I'm certainly not.
But I could be wrong about that. I certainly might be wrong.
Like I was mentioning with those birds that were working in, they worked into probably 80 to 100 yards. And if they got within 40, I was going to start getting on the app and buying my permit or buying my tag.
I gotcha.
There was no way I was going to let that opportunity pass. They're not looking in the tree too much like I was. But going back, I'm kind of interested. I didn't have this written down, but you had an interesting stat there where you saw a drop off on the number of hunters that were purchasing license. And I don't know if you collect this data or not either, but with the fact that we went to a one bird, I know several, even guys on our pro staff team, who will make that trip to Kentucky or make that trip to West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, etc. Do you work with those neighboring states? Have they maybe seen an increase in out-of-state hunter license purchases? I don't know if that's some data that you even collect. It's just something that came to my mind.
I mean, we do interact with our neighboring states, and I work specifically with the turkey biologists in those states.
Mm-hmm.
I've not heard them mention any major change in resident or non-resident licenses, excuse me. I mean, the observation that I guess I've had in Ohio is I have had a few out-of-state hunters, just in passing conversation, either folks that called to get clarification on a regulation or to get some sense of what bird numbers are doing recently. They have mentioned that coming to Ohio is a little less appealing.
Mm-hmm.
With a one bird bag limit versus a two bird bag limit.
Sure.
But I would say I've had just as many out of state hunters. And I just talked to a couple nice gentlemen from Florida last week, and I asked that exact question. They said that they have turkey hunted Ohio in the past. And I said, does it bother you that it's a one bird state, instead of a two bird state at this point? Mm-hmm. Has that impacted your decision on coming to Ohio? And they said, absolutely not. We love coming. Bird numbers are good.
Sure.
We're happy to take our one and head home or travel elsewhere or whatever the case might be. So I'm sure there's been a little bit of change as we see these regulations change, and maybe even within state hunters, that's impacted their decisions, whether to fall turkey hunt, spring turkey hunt, whatever it might be. But for the most part, it seems folks have been supportive of the regulation changes and have continued with their normal hunting activities. Yep. That hunter decline that I mentioned has been going on for 20 years.
Okay.
So
it's not anything.
Since the early 2000s, when we peaked at about 90,000 spring permits, every year since then we've dropped just a little bit, and I think a big part of that is just our gradual attrition and hunting participation.
Sure. Sure. Especially as the world becomes more and more digital. I mean, I think Tonkovich would have echoed the same thing. He saw a lot of hunter drop off even on the whitetail side too. So, and that's a much longer, I don't want to say more attractive, because I think birds are way more fun to chase, but that's it's more of a common hunting. If you're going to get someone into hunting, it's going to be whitetail as opposed to turkey. And so
Sure,
it's,
yeah.
if they're seeing it, it makes perfect sense that they're seeing the same thing on their end.
While we're talking about
Certainly.
this, I'm just curious. Did you guys see a spike during the whole COVID deal in hunters?
We did in resident hunters.
Mhm.
So there was a spike in 2020, spring 2020. It's one of the few years where we issued more permits than the previous year. So I mentioned for 20 some years we've been dropping step by step, just a few hundred or a few thousand permits less each year. So in 2019 we issued 63,000 permits. And then, as I mentioned, in 2020, we jumped up to 68. So we were actually 5,000 permits above the previous year. And then 2021, we dropped right back down to where you would expect with that gradual decline. We were actually at 61,000.
The timing of
So,
the timing would make sense for sure.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, and the caveat to that is we, in the spring of 2020, so in the midst of all of that COVID sort of restriction and so forth, we closed or we suspended non-resident permit sales because of the various travel restrictions and so forth. So actually, we issued very, very few non-resident permits in 2020. If you purchased the permit before that suspension, I think it was still a valid permit, and you were asked to adhere to travel restrictions and all those various things. But yeah, largely that bump, or almost exclusively that bump, came from resident hunters in that year. Yeah,
that's interesting. Good question, Ben, because I don't think we asked him that last time we talked. So that's interesting, a little tidbit there for sure too.
And a lot of states saw something very similar with their spring turkey permits.
I wanted to get into some of the stuff for last year too, but I didn't want to get too far away. So while we're recording this, you're about a week removed from convention. I know you went down to Nashville, and you mentioned talking to some guys in Florida. Hopefully you told them that Southeast Ohio has zero turkey population and they need to stay away from there. I know you didn't, but I wish you did.
Actually, they told me more than I told them. They said that their friend in southern Ohio was reporting excellent bird numbers. So I was very glad to hear that.
That is awesome. Yeah, I haven't been over. I mean, it's public land, so people are more than welcome to go there. I joke, but I went to the new Jesse Owens State Park. Or wildlife area now, the old AEP land that the state recently purchased, and they were there. I just couldn't get close to them, which I have some stuff I want to touch on that here in a minute. We'll get back to that, but I did want to ask about how your trip was to the convention, and specifically because you're going to be there with a lot of biologists from all over the country. What's the general overall consensus right now on all the different birds that we have spread out across the country? Is everyone are they in the same boat? Are they doing better? Are they doing worse? Kind of what's been the vibe across the country so far?
Yeah. So very interestingly, we are all, meaning all states, especially states with eastern subspecies.
Yes.
We seem to be in the same boat, a very similar boat, I should say. We all have seen a very similar pattern in our wild turkey populations. Meaning we hit some peak of abundance in recent decades, and now we're seeing this somewhat gradual, and in some states, unfortunately, not so gradual, maybe a little more alarming decline in wild turkey abundance. And for most of us, it does appear that it's at least partially the result of poor poult numbers. Now, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of things that go into poult numbers, so it leaves us scratching our heads. Is it nest success? Is it fertility rates? Is it clutch sizes? What's going on? Is it poult survival? Maybe everything with nesting is going well, but poult survival is low for whatever reason. And so there's actually a lot of wild turkey research going on right now, which is very interesting. I actually I spoke to a professor out of the Southeast who said he thought um, that there's more wild turkey research going on right now in 2023 than at any other time in the wild turkey's history. Now, of course, uh, there's there was a lot of wild turkey management activity going on in the past because of the extensive restoration efforts. But right now, there's a lot of research going on into uh, population vital rates and hen survival and reproduction and gobbler harvest. And as you look across the map, you can just check off almost every state's got some project going on trying to understand exactly what's going on with wild turkey. So you mentioned convention and the National Wild Turkey Federation convention. It was an excellent event. I get to sit in and hear some of the updates on wild turkey research and range and population changes. I get to that's a great opportunity for biologists like myself to interact with colleagues from across the country and sort of pick each other's brain. So I was able to meet with Mary Jo Castellana from Pennsylvania Game Commission. She's their turkey biologist, turkey program leader.
Okay.
And we could talk about some capture efforts on this collaborative project we're working on now.
Yeah.
How's your netting effort going? What's working, what's not? What equipment are you using? Is it working? Various things like that. So yeah, national convention. I mean, a lot of people are there for other reasons. They're either down on the show floor or they're at the calling competitions, and those are excellent. I try to get to those any chance I get. But very often I'm spending my time picking the brains of colleagues on wild turkey monitoring, management, and research.
Said just like a true Staten worker. He's there to work. He's not there to play.
There you go. Yep. I never even thought about having fun.
He didn't go to music. Work. He went to Music City and just worked. The poor guy.
Right.
Hey everyone, we need to take a quick break from the conversation to let you know about some of the events that we have coming up. First, you can come see us at the Ohio Open Season Sportsman's Expo this weekend at the Ohio State Fairgrounds. Stop by our booth, which is 724, and get entered into our $500 Vance Outdoors gift card giveaway. If you can't make it to the expo, you can also come see us at our spring hunting show next week. We have great deals on everything you need to bag that tom this year at our Hebron, Lebanon, and Obetz locations. We will also be hosting a turkey calling contest at our Hebron location on Saturday the 26th at 2 p.m. It's absolutely free to enter, and the winner of each class will take home a $300 Vance Outdoors gift card. Thanks, everyone. We look forward to seeing you there. Now let's get back into the conversation. Let's get into the season because I really do want to get into your capture efforts because I think it's really neat. Excuse me. Like I told you, in the industry that we're in, we don't necessarily hear from, a Mark Wiley all the time, but we do hear from John Smith or, whatever hunter. Excuse me. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence about last season and the success that a lot of people saw season. Now I know the weather was kind of wonky the start of last season opening day that weekend. I feel like it was pretty wonky, if I remember right. But I myself experienced working some birds and that were pretty hinned up. And I know that's probably a term that you hate, but that I had a couple toms that were 5-6 hens deep and extremely not interested in what I had to offer them. Have you kind of heard that from other people as well?
I mean, nothing particular from last year that stands out as unusual to me. The henned up comment, that is, I get that one every year.
Oh,
it's not one that I necessarily hate. I think often people use it, and I'm certain they've encountered henned up gobblers. Absolutely,
yes.
I fully believe them. But often it seems when they contact me about a henned up gobbler, they want to make the case for an earlier season.
And I had a note here not to tell you that because Andrew made sure I didn't say that because
my brain goes the complete opposite direction. When somebody says, "Well, I went out and gobbler had 8 hens with him. He was henned up. He wanted nothing to do with me.
Yes.
And my biologist brain goes, well, then you were out there too early. We shouldn't have let you out there that early.
Yeah.
He still had work to do.
He did. He did.
And so, I mean, I encounter that. It's going to happen. We're pursuing the bird during the breeding season. Ideally, if we time the season perfectly, and there is no perfect by any stretch, because we set a date well in advance. Even if you set the date just a month in advance, you never know what the weather is going to be like and what the bird activity will be like for that particular year. So we set the season date on a sort of a long-term average of nesting chronology. And our hope is that the majority of hens have bred at least once by the start of season, and that many of them have begun laying eggs, if not incubating their nests. And so those gobblers are still very, very active, but they've had an opportunity to fertilize those hens, and those hens have had the opportunity to move away from those gobblers and begin their nesting attempt before any disruption is introduced to the system by the spring hunter. So in terms of last year, as I mentioned, nothing really stood out as unusual. No more henned up gobblers than any other year. I certainly did receive some of those reports, but for the large part, the comments were continued concern about not hearing as many birds as we normally hear.
Yep.
And then actually we received a lot of positive comments about the bag limit change. And certainly have to commend leadership within the Division of Wildlife and then the Wildlife Council for being bold enough to make that change before biologists like me could offer them any sort of scientific information. There was no study done to say, hey, the bag limit change is necessary and here's why. That was an action they took with just a little bit of support from hunter surveys.
Sure. And I'm definitely one of those people that would support that. I'm still a relatively green turkey hunter, if you will. I've only had a couple seasons under my belt, and to me, everyone's so busy. I mean, at least I am as a young dad. I'm so busy in the spring anyway that I may get that opening weekend, and that's about it. Because guess what? You're going to work Monday through Friday, and you have maybe 3-4 weekends to get it done. So I was certainly open to that. I can't echo just on my personal experience. Again, there's no research to support my claim, but being in the Southeast Ohio area, we thought that we had a pretty good lock on some birds. And I know we didn't want to get into the anatomy part of it, but come that lull time, the nap time at 10 o'clock, I didn't really hear anything but just a couple birds the entire weekend, if you will, that we were down there. And this is in Southeast Ohio, where the population is arguably probably the best. So there's a lot of things that tie into that. If you ask most hunters, they're probably going to blame the raccoons and all the bobcat now. But
I've heard a little of that, yeah.
Yeah, just a little bit, right? You've never heard someone say that we need a bobcat season, have you? I bet you've never heard that.
And I didn't, yeah. And we have raccoons?
Yeah. Never heard of them. Never heard of them. But yeah, and I'm glad that I'm glad that you mentioned that too, because I think it's important to let people know kind of how you determine those season start dates. So you kind of touched on that a little bit more. I don't know if you could probably go into more detail on kind of how you determine that, but essentially, you're just trying to pick a date. I mean, before you get into that though, I kind of wanted to explain it just a little bit, and this was explained how it was explained to me, but I'm trying to use a whitetail reference, if you will. So let's say that, and Mark, if I'm wrong, just please stop me, but essentially what I was told, and kind of to put it into a whitetail where a lot of people understand, let's say you started turkey hunting a month after the rut began. That's kind of what you're working with spring turkey hunting. Is that kind of on base?
Yeah, I mean, I always get a little bit leery of making comparisons with deer. Mm-hmm. Deer and turkey are the same in a lot of ways, but our management and our harvest management specifically for the two species are very different. And actually, a lot of people use deer rut sort of as an example
Mm-hmm.
of why they feel like we should hunt turkeys earlier. They
Oh,
say, well,
yeah, I can see
we
that.
hunt deer during the rut, and so I should be able to hunt turkeys even while they're breeding,
Sure.
or earlier in the season. And that's not, I mean, we have different management strategies for deer and turkey, certainly in some cases, and I don't want to get,
No,
definitely don't want to step on
no, you're
Mike
fine.
Tonkovich's toes and don't want to pretend like I know a fraction of what he does about deer. But in many cases, whether hunters like to hear it or not, deer harvest management goals can be to reduce the deer population in an area. They
Yes.
may very well
Yes.
want to sort of knock deer numbers down to a degree. That is not part of our turkey management strategy at all. We don't have turkey in the numbers that we do whitetail deer. Turkey don't necessarily cause some of the issues that deer do in vehicle collisions. They certainly can collide with vehicles and cause damage, but not to the degree that whitetail deer do. Crop damage, similarly, it can happen with wild turkey, but it's not to the severity that whitetail deer do. So I mean, that's the big one. Is there is no objective in in wild turkey
Mm-hmm.
harvest
Yeah.
management to reduce turkey numbers. We
Makes sense.
want, every regulation we have, even though we're taking turkeys off the landscape by harvesting them,
It's
the
to,
regulation is set to maximize their abundance for future years.
perfect. Yeah.
And so there's a big difference there. And then you had mentioned the timing in
Yeah.
spring. A lot of people make the mistake. They think that our focus is gobbling activity. And while we recognize gobbling activity is important, it's the most important factor for the spring hunter in terms of their satisfaction. And when we ask hunters, what is a successful hunt to you, or what gets you in the field year after year, consistently, it's gobbling activity. I want to go out and I want to hear gobbling. I want to interact with a gobbling bird. To a lesser degree, it's an opportunity to harvest a bird, or actually harvesting a bird. They want to go out and they want to hear gobbling, and I can understand that.
Yeah.
But the season dates are actually focused on the nest timing, the nesting chronology, and gobbling is paired with that to a degree. But what we see is we see gobbling activity ramps up, and it's already started. I've already heard some gobbling, sitting in the blind trying to catch some birds in
Yeah.
southern Ohio, and it'll continue to increase that gobbling activity. But the hens are nowhere near ready to
Sure.
attempt their nests. We won't see that spike or that peak in breeding and nesting activity until April, and so we position our season sort of at the median date of nest or initiation of incubating their eggs. And that's based on some research that was done 17 years ago in Southeast Ohio. And then when we developed the Northeast zone,
Yeah.
we replicated that research in 2014 and 15, and we did identify that birds were nesting a little bit later in that corner of the state. And that's why we have that
That's
Northeast
different.
zone with
Yep.
a slightly later start date,
Gotcha.
is we want to position that date appropriately so that we have no negative impact or negligible negative
Mm-hmm.
impact on nesting hens and turkey reproduction. Because again, we do not want to reduce turkey numbers. We want to keep them very strong, but we want to allow harvest opportunity when it's appropriate.
And that's a great answer too. I'm glad you said that, because you do have a complete opposite, if you will, especially now in the world that we are in with whitetails and CWD and other types of, diseases, like EHD. They're trying to knock down those numbers, whereas you're trying to benefit the overall population across the state. So, excuse me. One thing I wanted to mention, and Ben, you remember, Mike kind of talked about it a little bit too, but deer, when we ask, he doesn't look at deer as a whole state unit. As you know, there's different bag limits per different counties.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure in the wild turkey side of things, you guys are you looking at on a county to county? I mean, I know the bag limit is the bag limit, But are you looking at your research as on a county to county basis, or is it kind of more regionally based? How does that work?
Yeah, we do have a system similar to deer in that regard. This is another really common question uh, from Ohio hunters is,
Sure.
well, why does one county have a 4 deer bag limit and another has a 2 deer bag limit, and
Yes.
yet we can kill a wild turkey in any Ohio, one turkey in any Ohio county.
Yep.
Well, in the spring, the way that I would encourage you to look at spring, because it is a bearded bird, mostly male, it's very similar to shooting an antlered deer, which you can shoot one
Yes.
antlered deer in any Ohio county. And then once you shoot your one, you're done.
Yep.
And that's, again, those are male animals. They serve one role, and that is to fertilize females. And after that's done, reproduction can continue unhindered. And you're going to have more animals on the landscape the next year, even though that male was removed. But in the fall, for wild turkey, that is an either sex permit. There is no restriction on bearded, no beard, hen, gobbler, jake, jenny. You can shoot one bird. And about half of our fall harvest is are hens. And so the way that I would ask you to look at the fall hunting opportunity as that fluctuating bag limit or bag limit that people mention with deer. So in the fall, not all of our counties are open. There are, I don't know the count now, but it's a dozen or so counties, sure, mostly central and west central Ohio, counties that have wild turkey, but their population in those counties is probably the lowest. Their abundance in those counties is probably the lowest in the state. Those are not open to fall hunting. So basically, no fall hunting opportunity, no fall bag limit. So you can look at those as one turkey counties. You're allowed to shoot a bearded bird in any of those counties in the spring, but you cannot hunt turkeys at any other time. You cannot harvest any additional turkeys in those counties.
Gotcha.
In those counties that are open in the fall, you can look at that as your second turkey. Comparing to a county that has multiple, 4 deer bag limit or whatever the case might be. Now, before I get myself into trouble, people often use that example and say, well, then I should be able to use my spring permit in the fall or my fall permit in the spring. And most of the time people want to use their spring permit in the upcoming fall. We don't allow that for very good reason. Essentially, you would be taking that bearded permit, a permit that allows you to harvest a male wild turkey, mostly male. Again, there's a small number of bearded females out there. I think we all know that. But essentially, that spring permit is your permission to take a male wild turkey, which we just talked about doesn't have a lot of value to the reproductive effort. They serve a very important function, but once that function is complete, we don't need those birds as much anymore. Yep. We would not want you to be able to convert that into a fall permit that allows you to shoot a hen. You would be taking 60,000 male permits and converting them in the fall into either sex permits, and then the potential to overharvest hens in the fall would be considerably greater.
Oh, I bet.
So we issue about 50,000 spring permits currently in the one permit system. In the fall season, we only issue 7,000 permits. I mentioned it's not as popular a season. And one of the reasons we can offer that fall season in its current form is because it's not that popular. There's not a tremendous risk with an either sex fall regulation that we're going to overharvest hens because so few hunters are participating. Now, if for whatever reason, all of a sudden fall turkey hunting in Ohio becomes extremely popular, we may very well have to make some regulatory changes to ensure that we don't kill too many hens. But that's the primary reason why we have very distinct spring and fall permits.
I know you and Jordan have talked about it, the trapping effort and everything, and we want to touch on that because I'm really interested. I know Jordan is.
Yeah, we had a bunch of emails going back and forth trying to schedule this, and I'm like, man, where's my helicopter ride? And I did want to joke. You had mentioned that you were doing some research for this particular project that you're about ready to talk about in Southern Ohio. How much do those mapping pins cost? We can talk about that offline, right? I'm just kidding.
The what pin?
Will you sell your Onyx pins?
Yeah, I got you.
Where are your GPS?
Yeah.
Where's your GPS pins? How much of those are going to cost me this year? I don't live too far from Southern Ohio, so you just let me know.
Well, I'm sure if somebody really wants to press us, we've got to share that information.
Yes, sir.
The caveat I'll give you is it might take so long for us to get the information to you. Those turkeys are in a different township by the time,
or dead.
By the time you. So I wish you luck. Yeah, good luck.
All the turkeys are in Northwest Ohio. People, just keep going up there. Stay away from Athens. Stay away from Athens and Meigs County, please.
There you go. Yep.
No, but to go back to that though, we did have a lot of emails back and forth about the efforts that you have with Ohio State. You kind of touched on it a couple times so far. I do want to get into that because I think the listeners will find the way that you're going about trying to find this information very, very cool. I mean, it is cool stuff that you're doing right now.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. You want me to just dive into it, or do you have some specific questions?
No, go for it. Yeah, go for it. I know. I mean, we can talk. I think
feel free to cut me off. You got me. Yeah.
Yeah, the netting.
Always happy to talk turkey, and I can just get on a roll.
Yeah, I think the netting from the helicopter, where you were telling us, we were trying to look for the right day. So maybe we can dive into what's the ideal day for you to try to to net birds. How are you netting them? The whole process.
Certainly.
So once you do net them, are they tagged? Are they radio collared? Like that kind of stuff.
Certainly. So it's not quite as exciting as you think. So we didn't actually net from the helicopter. That is a wildlife management technique that actually some of our biologists have used on things like sandhill cranes and some other, I think, swans. But we don't. Yeah, unfortunately, they don't hand me a net gun.
He's not up there like shooting wild hogs in Texas with a helicopter.
Right. Yeah. So I guess for your listeners, we had to reschedule this a few times.
Yeah.
And the first time we had snow cover back in January, and it's the last snow we've had, and it might be the last snow of the year.
Hard to believe, right?
Right. And so the urgency for us. The division with that snow cover is a great time to spot wild turkey, either spot the animal from the air or spot where they have been out scratching. So we got a little bit of snow, and it was only going to last a short time, and so we got the helicopter up over some of our research areas because we wanted to identify areas where flocks of turkeys were frequenting, so that we could target those areas for our netting efforts. And so the nets, they are rocket propelled nets, so I don't want to make it sound like it's not cool.
It's out there like Rambo.
It's a really cool thing to do, right? Yeah. So these are actually, they're deployed from a box on the ground. So once we identify an area, either from the air or our staff spot a flock of wild turkeys, we'll start a baiting effort and get them coming to a bait site. And then we'll put that net out when they're using that baited area frequently. We'll get the net box out there and basically wait in a blind. It's a little bit like hunting.
Yeah.
I would say hunting has been good training for me to just sit in a blind and wait and wait and wait. But when you get turkeys coming in, you can deploy that rocket net. Hopefully it deploys successfully, and it'll fire that net over the flock of turkeys. And then you've got a mess on your hands, picking adult wild turkeys out of a big net on the ground. It takes a lot of staff. We bring in a lot of hands to try to get those birds out of the net and into. Essentially, we've got cardboard boxes provided by the National Wild Turkey Federation. They're boxes that were used in the transport effort years ago. We've got
Okay.
a
Yeah.
stash of them tucked away. So we get those birds, once we get them out of the net, we get them secured in a box. We work them one at a time, and we get a number of measurements on them, length of legs and wings and weight, and various things. And then if we have hens that are in good shape and good health, they get a little backpack transmitter. It's a GPS transmitter that puts out a radio signal that we can pick up and actually remotely download the GPS positions from those hens. And it's got some motion triggers built into it. It's all
Awesome.
much fancier than when I did my master's work
Oh, I bet.
about 15 years ago, when we just followed a beat in the woods or in the fields and tracking northern bobwhite. Now there's a lot of fancy equipment on here that actually the OSU researchers, once they get that data, they can tell not only where the bird has been, but what sort of activities they've been doing based on that movement, which includes nest initiation or incubation. And so when they get that data this spring, they should be able to pinpoint when each of these hens has attempted a nest and how many days they were with that nest. And if the nest fails, then we ought to be able to get out there pretty quickly and investigate why the nest may have failed. Was it a predator event?
Sure.
Was it a weather event? What happened? Similarly, it'll let us know if the bird is no longer alive. We'll get a specific mortality signal that lets us know the bird, essentially, that if the bird hasn't moved for a certain period of time, we'll know that it's likely dead, and we can get out and investigate, try to figure out what sort of, what might have been the cause of death, typically predation, and we can try to identify exactly what predator may have caused that bird's death. So we're actually in the middle of our trapping season right now. So yeah, when you said you were at Appalachian Hills, Jesse Owens,
Yes. Yep.
that's an area we're looking at. So yeah, if you encountered some birds when you were down there, I'd kind of like to know where they were. We don't have to do that as part of the recording, but maybe later.
Yeah, I can.
But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we've got some baited areas out there now, and then some others across southeastern Ohio, state forests and wildlife areas. And so we had our first net attempt last week, just before convention. It was well timed.
Cool.
And we got our first transmitters out, and actually OSU was tracking those birds earlier in the week, and it sounds like all of them are in good health so far. They returned to their flock. And one of them was actually spotted on a trail camera.
That's awesome.
With a little backpack on.
That's awesome.
That is cool. So, like when you guys do this, do you have open, I guess, like if you're looking for hands for people to help you, is there a place where people can volunteer to do that? Or do you just take like folks that are in school for it? Or how does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, for other efforts, we do have volunteer opportunities. This one is a little more tricky because of the rocket nets. We have to be very cautious, even with our staff, about who operates around, is working around, or is close to these rocket nets that are fairly dangerous. So we go through a training each year, even for staff, to be able to work with these essentially explosives.
Sure.
So we have to be a little bit cautious about getting volunteers out there for those efforts. And it can also be logistically challenging, even if you were to wait away from the rocket netting effort to get people there quick enough, when we're working over these birds. So, I mean, the potential is there, and we probably will try to get some folks out that haven't experienced this specifically within the division. It's been a few decades since many division staff have trapped wild turkey, and we're losing some of those folks to retirement.
Yeah.
And some of the expertise within the division that did some extensive wild turkey trapping. So we are trying to get our staff out there and get them on netting attempts, get them handling birds and sort of going through the process. So we keep that institutional knowledge and experience within the division, certainly. but OSU will have some folks out there. Some may be students. I'm not sure. Certainly, they have a graduate student on the project.
Yeah.
And he was out with us on our first trapping attempt. And then, I suppose we'll just have to see. Right now, it's just a frantic effort to catch as many birds as they want. So
sure. Yeah.
And I'm glad
certainly.
you mentioned the baiting part too, which I think is pretty important piece of information too. You had to wait until a certain time period after whitetail season concluded because of the baiting. You are baiting on public land, which obviously, as you know, as a whitetail hunter, is not something that you want to do or can do. So
That's
go ahead.
correct. Yeah. So we were in a little bit of a crunch because we have such a long deer season. I think February 5th maybe was the end of archery this year. So February 6th, that was our first date to get bait on the ground. And then on the other end of spring, I guess, we'll have to shut everything down pretty early in April, likely April 1st, to ensure that we're not baiting turkeys into an area and causing any issue with spring turkey hunting. So we've got a fairly narrow window, February to March, in which we're going to be able to try to catch these birds.
Yeah, that's why when we were scheduling this, I'm like, I'm going to do whatever he needs to do because he kind of explained this to us through email. And it's like, okay, I'm here Monday through Friday. You just tell me what's good for you and we'll make it work because you have an extremely tight window to do a lot of work.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So we've got some birds on bait now. I got calls from our staff. And unfortunately, tomorrow looks like just a complete rain out, which we can't net in the rain. So we're gonna have to hope that those birds stay on bait for a couple days, and maybe end of the week we'll try to get everybody out. I always hate bringing people out on a Friday. We've got a lot of staff that are very dedicated and excited about this effort.
Well, I'm sure.
So I don't think I'm gonna have any trouble getting volunteers. This Friday.
No, if not, you just hand them their pink slip. No, just kidding. Awesome.
Yeah, I've been very encouraged. There've been a lot of folks excited about this project. I'm one included. I may have mentioned before, we've not done anything this extensive with wild turkey for 17 years. So it's a very exciting time.
For sure.
To be working in wild turkey management.
Oh, for sure. And I feel like it's definitely going to get us the information that we as hunters and you as biologists, everyone's going to want to know. And so, once, like you said, once you can identify the root of issues with population and then you can control that management strategy, it's a win-win for sure.
Hopefully within time, we'll have the same issue we're having with the deer population here in Ohio.
Right. Just too darn many turkeys. Yeah. You bring up an excellent point. I started talking survival and reproduction and all those various things, but some of these things that are of particular concern to a lot of our wild turkey hunters, like predation, and we made our jokes about bobcats and raccoons. Raccoons are extremely abundant. They may be at a higher abundance than at any other time in Ohio's history. But we can't just run with that and say, hey, here's the problem. How are we going to fix it? This OSU research will really help us identify what some of the true factors are which are influencing wild turkey abundance in Ohio.
Yeah. And like I said, when we were talking earlier, I feel like the predation piece of this is something that you see. I think there was just an Instagram Facebook post or something I saw the other day. It was instead of a coyote hunt, it was a raccoon hunt. There were hundreds of raccoons laying out, and I'm all for trapping. I'm all for the management of predators. The more we can take off, the more we can take out, the better the population. But to say that it's the sole reason why, I have a hard time believing that. I do. If Mark isn't telling me it, then why would I listen to John Smith tell me it? And so that's, and no offense to John Smith, but that's, he believes what he sees, but I'm going to tend to resort to the people that are out there doing it every day. So
yeah, certainly, and yeah, don't give me too much credit there. I mean, the John Smiths, there's very knowledgeable folks out
I'm
there.
sure. Yep.
You take each of their opinions, and you mentioned anecdote. You
Hmm.
take each of that for what it's worth. A single anecdote, maybe, you don't doesn't sway your opinion, but when you
Sure.
start to get a lot of anecdote build up, I mean, essentially just like scientific observation,
Yes.
when
Yes.
you have an overwhelming number of observations on one side, with free from bias, we'll
Yep.
say, you've got to start paying attention to that. And so,
Hmm.
again, I think this research is well timed for Ohio, and I think it's going to shed a lot of light on some of the issues that wild turkeys face and answer a lot of questions for Ohio's wild turkey hunters.
Awesome. There he goes. It's funny. I actually saw a raccoon the other night. I'm gonna let him go on this. I saw a raccoon. I have chickens, Mark, and
Yes.
they were already roosted in their coop, and the raccoon was eating the feed on the ground. They typically only go for feed. I haven't had any issues with them trying to get into the coop. And that raccoon, I swear, he, of course it's dark. It was the size of a beagle, like a full fat, big old. I'm like, holy smoke! It scared I was like, goodness. So, yeah, I'm all for taking them out for sure. But yeah, I mean, you gotta take everything in collection. You can't just say one thing here, one thing there. But like Mark said, if there's enough of this, then maybe it warrants a look. But right now, this is where we're looking at. Take everything in and make a reasonable decision. So this went exactly like I thought it would, Mark. I appreciate you coming on again. It's like I said, you were our first true professional in the industry, so we appreciate you coming back on. I wish you could have been on video today. The last time we spoke, we were sitting in a conference room with moving blankets to keep the echo down, and we were very green into this, and we've definitely come a long way since then. But we do appreciate you coming back on. It's always good when we get Mark on because we know that we're getting close to turkey season, and for you, buddy, we're getting close to fishing season.
Yeah.
So it's always good when Mark comes
go.
on. We're turning the corner here, and believe it or not, we still are in winter. So,
Unfortunately.
Yep.
Yeah.
well, Mark,
Well, it was my pleasure. I appreciate you having me on.
yep, have a great afternoon, Mark. Thank you. All right, everyone, that is all we have for you today. We really hoped you enjoyed that conversation with Mark. As you heard on today's episode, Mark is on a time crunch to finish that research project before the end of the month, and we really appreciate him taking the time to chat with us. As a reminder, we are on the bi-weekly schedule from now on, so our next episode release will be on Tuesday, March 28th. And as always, we appreciate you listening, and until next time, enjoy the pursuit.